Picture a classroom where no textbooks line the shelves, where students don't scribble notes on parchment, and yet somehow the brightest minds of an era emerge. This wasn't some lost utopia or fantasy. This was the everyday reality of medieval education, a system so ingenious, so adaptable, that it shaped thinkers, builders, and visionaries for centuries without the crutch of mass-produced books. How did they do it? How did societies cultivate philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, architects of cathedrals that still awe us today, and leaders who navigated the complexities of feudalism, all while most people couldn't even read? The answer lies in a web of oral traditions, hands-on apprenticeships, and the quiet, relentless dedication of monastic scribes. And here's what's truly astonishing: this system didn't just survive. It thrived, turning limitations into opportunities for innovation. Think about that for a moment. In an age where we take instant access to information for granted, where a world of knowledge fits in our pockets, the medieval approach feels almost alien. But that's exactly why it's worth understanding, because this isn't just a story about the past, it's a testament to human creativity under constraint. When books were precious and rare, education didn't collapse, it transformed. It became communal, passed down through stories recited by firelight, skills honed shoulder to shoulder in workshops, and debates echoing through cloistered courtyards. The medieval world reminds us that learning isn't about the tools you have. It's about the hunger to understand and the willingness to adapt. So what can we learn from these forgotten classrooms? How did a system built on memory and mentorship lay the groundwork for universities, guilds, and even modern apprenticeships? Over the next few minutes, we'll step into the shoes of a medieval student, feeling the wax tablets beneath their fingers, hearing the chant of Latin verses, witnessing the slow, deliberate birth of ideas that would outlast empires. This is more than history. It's a mirror held up to our own assumptions about education, resilience, and the timeless human drive to pass the torch of knowledge. Ready to uncover how the Middle Ages taught the world to think? Let's begin. The rhythm of learning in the Middle Ages pulsed not on pages, but in the air itself, spoken, sung, and sometimes shouted into being. Imagine a village elder recounting the laws of the land word for word, his voice rising and falling like a metronome, or a monk chanting psalms in the flickering candlelight, each syllable imprinted on the minds of his brothers through relentless repetition. This was education stripped to its essence, human voices weaving a living tapestry of knowledge, thread by thread. What's easy to overlook is how sophisticated this oral tradition truly was. It wasn't mere rote repetition. It was a finely tuned system of mnemonics, rhythms, and even physical gestures that helped lock information into place. Epic poems like Beowulf or the Song of Roland weren't just entertainment. They were memory palaces in verse form, their alliteration and meter acting as mental hooks. A bard could recite thousands of lines flawlessly because the story's structure, its battles, feasts, and speeches created natural compartments in the mind. And this skill wasn't reserved for poets. Guild masters taught apprentices complex craft techniques through chanted instructions, turning steps like forging iron or weaving cloth into rhythmic routines. The classroom of the medieval world was wherever voices gathered. In monasteries, novices learned scripture by echoing their teachers in call and response drills, their voices blending into a single stream of devotion. In castle halls, jongleurs spun histories into ballads, making the deeds of kings unforgettable through melody. Even law schools relied on oral disputation, students arguing cases aloud, honing their wits through spoken debate rather than written briefs. This constant verbal exchange did more than preserve knowledge. It sharpened minds to think on their feet, to listen intently, and to distill ideas into their most potent spoken form. And here's the twist. This tradition left a legacy deeper than we often realize. Those rhythmic teaching methods, they evolved into the lecture halls of early universities, where professors read texts aloud to students not because books were absent, but because the act of hearing and repeating was still central to learning. The guild's chanted instructions became the scaffolding for technical education centuries later. Even today, we see echoes of medieval orality in everything from military drills to childhood nursery rhymes. The Middle Ages didn't just teach people to remember, they taught them how to learn. Monasteries weren't just quiet retreats for prayer, they were bustling nerve centers of learning, where the flick of a quill could mean the difference between losing a masterpiece of antiquity or saving it for future generations. Picture a monk hunched over a parchment in the cold light of dawn, his hand moving with deliberate precision as he copies Cicero's speeches or Euclid's geometry. Each stroke of ink was an act of devotion, not just to God but to knowledge itself. But these monastic schools were far more than scriptoriums. They were classrooms without walls, where education unfolded in a rhythm of chant, debate, and painstaking practice. Young boys, often sent by noble families hoping to secure their futures, entered these cloistered worlds as oblates, trading the noise of the outside for the disciplined hum of Latin recitations. Their days were structured around the divine office, with lessons woven between prayers. A master would read aloud from a single precious manuscript, his voice carving the words into the minds of his students, who then repeated them back in unison. This wasn't passive learning, it was a full-body exercise. Students traced letters in wax tablets, their fingers memorizing shapes before they ever touched ink to parchment. They debated theology in structured disputations, learning to argue with logic sharpened by Aristotle's rediscovered texts. And always, they listened because in a world without textbooks, the ear was the primary gateway to wisdom. The irony, these secluded communities became unexpected bridges across time. While wars raged outside their walls, monks preserved not just scripture, but the works of Roman poets, Greek scientists, and Arab mathematicians. A monastery in Burgundy might shelter a crumbling copy of Virgil, while another in Spain painstakingly translated Arabic medical treatises into Latin. This slow, silent labor laid the groundwork for the Renaissance centuries before it bloomed. Yet for all their influence, monastic schools were just one thread in medieval education's rich tapestry. Beyond the cloister, another institution was rising: cathedral schools, where the pulse of learning began to quicken in step with Europe's growing cities. Cathedral schools were where the medieval world began to hum with a new kind of energy, the buzz of a rising urban class hungry for knowledge. Picture the scene: a vaulted hall attached to a bustling cathedral, filled not just with future priests but sons of merchants, aspiring lawyers, even the occasional ambitious craftsman. These weren't quiet cloisters devoted solely to spiritual study. They were vibrant hubs where practical skills met intellectual rigor, fueled by the needs of growing cities. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic formed the backbone of instruction, the famous trivium, but the approach was anything but dry. Masters taught through spirited debates, dissecting texts line by line, training students to think critically and speak persuasively. What set cathedral schools apart was their accessibility. Unlike monastic schools, which often required vows of devotion, these institutions welcomed those destined for secular careers. A merchant's son might learn to draft contracts by studying Latin legal phrases. A town clerk could master the art of record-keeping through structured exercises in rhetoric. Even the teaching methods adapted to urban life. Lectures were delivered aloud to crowds of students, some jotting notes on wax tablets, others committing every word to memory. This wasn't just education, it was networking, with students forming bonds that would later shape guilds, courts, and city governments. The leap from cathedral schools to universities wasn't a sudden revolution. It was more like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering momentum. As certain schools gained reputations for expertise, like Chartres for philosophy or Bologna for law, students began traveling across Europe to study under famous masters. These migrations created something unprecedented, communities of learning so large they needed formal structures to govern them. By the 12th century, groups of teachers and students were securing charters from popes and kings, transforming informal gatherings into institutions with defined curricula, degrees, and even student protections. The word universitas originally meant a guild, and that's exactly what these early universities were. Guilds of knowledge, where masters and apprentices collectively pushed the boundaries of what could be known. Yet the heartbeat of these new universities still echoed their cathedral school origins. Lectures remained oral performances, with professors unpacking dense texts phrase by phrase. Disputations formalized debates where students defended positions against peers and masters were the crucible of learning, sharpening minds through the same verbal sparring that had once echoed in monastic courtyards. Even the degree system had roots in the guilds, with bachelor originally meaning a junior craftsman of knowledge, and master signifying one deemed ready to teach. The medieval classroom, it turns out, was never just a place to absorb information. It was a training ground for a society learning how to organize, argue, and innovate, one spoken word at a time. The rise of universities marked a turning point in medieval education, but not in the way we might expect. These weren't the quiet, book-filled halls of today. Instead, imagine Bologna in the 12th century, a cacophony of voices arguing in Latin, students jostling for space in crowded lecture yards, and masters reciting entire texts from memory while listeners scribbled notes on wax tablets. What made these early universities revolutionary wasn't just what they taught, but how they taught it. Without easy access to books, professors became walking libraries, their minds holding entire treatises of law, philosophy, or medicine. A single lecture might stretch for hours, with the master unpacking a passage line by line, not just explaining it, but challenging students to dissect its logic, spot contradictions, and defend their interpretations in fiery public debates. At the heart of this system were the disputations, intellectual showdowns where knowledge wasn't just recited but tested in the crucible of argument. Picture a young scholar standing before his peers, tasked with defending Aristotle's views on motion against objections hurled by both classmates and masters. There were no multiple-choice exams here. Mastery meant thinking on your feet, marshalling evidence, and turning opponents' words against them, all in precise, scholarly Latin. These debates weren't just academic exercises, they were training for a world where legal disputes, theological controversies, and political negotiations hinged on the same skills of persuasion and analysis. Yet the university curriculum itself was a bridge between old and new. The trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic equipped students to wield language like a craftsman's tool, while the quadrivium's focus on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy connected them to the natural world's hidden patterns. A law student in Bologna might apply Euclidean geometry to land disputes. A Parisian theologian could use musical theory to explore cosmic harmony. This wasn't education for its own sake. It was preparation for solving real problems, from calculating inheritance shares to designing cathedrals that defied gravity. But for all their brilliance, universities were islands in a much wider sea of learning. While the sons of nobles and wealthy merchants debated in Latin, Europe's workshops hummed with a different kind of education, one where knowledge passed not through lectures, but through calloused hands guiding young apprentices. Guilds had their own rigorous systems, with milestones as demanding as any university degree. A blacksmith's apprentice didn't learn metallurgy from books. He felt it in the forge's heat, the hammer's weight, the way iron shimmered at just the right temperature for shaping. These were classrooms without walls, where mastery came stitch by stitch, chisel stroke by chisel stroke, under the watchful eye of a mentor who'd spent decades perfecting the craft. What's striking is how these two worlds, university and guild, began to intertwine. The same intellectual ferment that fueled scholastic debates also seeped into workshops, where artisans applied geometry to stonework or experimented with pigments like alchemists. A cathedral's construction site became a living classroom, bringing together scholars who'd calculated its proportions and masons who turned those numbers into soaring arches. The medieval education system, for all its divisions, was quietly knitting itself into something greater, a tapestry where hands and minds worked in concert, laying foundations we still walk upon today. While universities and cathedral schools catered to the scholarly elite, the real engine of medieval education hummed in workshops and market stalls, places where knowledge lived in the hands, not just the mind. Picture a 12-year-old boy standing beside a master blacksmith, his arms trembling as he lifts a hammer for the first time. The heat of the forge licks his face while the older man guides his wrist, showing him the precise angle to strike molten iron. No diagrams, no instruction manuals, just touch, repetition, and the occasional sharp correction when his grip faltered. This was apprenticeship, an education written in calluses and muscle memory, where expertise passed like a slow-burning flame from one generation to the next. Guilds turned this hands-on tradition into a finely tuned system. To become a master craftsman, a young apprentice might spend 7 years or more shadowing a mentor, sweeping floors, fetching tools, and gradually advancing to complex tasks under watchful eyes. Each trade had its rituals. A weaver's apprentice learned to distinguish wool textures by touch before ever threading a loom. A stonemason traced geometric patterns in the dirt with a stick long before chiseling cathedral gargoyles. These weren't just technical skills, they were ways of seeing the world. A carpenter didn't just measure wood, he learned to read its grain, predicting how planks would warp with seasons. This intimate, tactile knowledge built the physical fabric of medieval life, from the shoes on peasants' feet to the vaulted ceilings of charters. Yet half the story remains untold. While guild records often spotlight male apprentices, women were far from absent from this hands-on education. In countless households, mothers taught daughters the alchemy of turning herbs into medicines, the calculus of stretching scarce ingredients through winter. Textile trades, especially silk and embroidery, saw girls apprenticed as young as 7, their fingers trained to navigate intricate patterns without a single sketched guide. Some women even breached guild barriers. In Paris, the Livre des Métiers listed female parchment makers and goldsmiths, while Italian notaries documented wives and daughters inheriting workshops when plague or war left gaps in male lineages. Their achievements whisper through legal disputes, like the 14th century English case where a widow successfully argued her right to run her late husband's blacksmith forge, proving her years of unofficial apprenticeship beside him. What made this system remarkable wasn't just its effectiveness, but its adaptability. Without standardized tests or diplomas, guilds enforced quality through communal scrutiny. A young baker's first solo loaf might be judged by the entire guild, not just on taste, but on weight, texture, even the fairness of its price. Failure carried real consequences. A dyer whose fabrics faded could face fines or expulsion. This collective accountability created networks of trust that stretched across Europe. A master mason's mark chiseled into a cornerstone in Cologne signaled competence to builders in Burgundy. The true legacy of medieval apprenticeships lies in their insistence that wisdom lives in practice as much as theory. When we admire a Gothic cathedral's stained glass today, we're seeing more than artistry. We're witnessing centuries of unspoken knowledge, passed palm to palm in dimly lit workshops. The apprentice who mixed pigments by trial and error, the weaver who memorized hundreds of stitch patterns, the blacksmith who felt the perfect tempering heat in his bones, they remind us that some truths can't be written down. They must be lived, forged in the fire of repetition, and carried forward by those willing to dirty their hands. Behind the well-documented stories of medieval scholars and craftsmen lies a quieter, often overlooked revolution. The determined pursuit of knowledge by women in a world that rarely acknowledged their intellect. While cathedral schools and universities barred their doors to female students, women carved out spaces to learn wherever they could. In castle chambers, noble daughters pored over manuscripts by candlelight, mastering not just embroidery but estate accounting and diplomacy. Convent scriptoriums buzzed with activity as nuns copied sacred texts and composed original works, their quills scratching out theological treatises alongside remedies for fevers. Even in peasant cottages, mothers taught daughters the subtle arts of herbal medicine, their hands memorizing the feel of feverfew leaves or the scent of infected wounds. Take Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who defied every expectation. With no formal schooling, she mastered Latin enough to write groundbreaking works on medicine, theology, and even musical composition. Her Physica detailed the healing properties of hundreds of plants, while her visions, recorded in civias, blended science and mysticism in ways that fascinated popes and emperors. Yet Hildegard was no outlier. Across Europe, convents functioned as intellectual sanctuaries where women like Herad of Landsberg compiled encyclopedias, and abbesses corresponded with the era's greatest thinkers. These weren't just places of prayer, they were libraries, laboratories, and publishing houses rolled into one. Beyond cloister walls, women's education took even more pragmatic forms. A noblewoman managing her husband's estates in his absence needed literacy to review ledgers, legal savvy to settle tenant disputes, and diplomatic skill to negotiate with neighboring lords. Manuscripts like the Goodman of Paris, a 14th century guide written by a husband for his young wife, reveal the staggering breadth of knowledge expected of elite women, from detecting counterfeit coins to supervising crop rotations. Meanwhile, in towns, midwives trained apprentices through hands-on practice, their expertise in childbirth passing orally from one generation to the next. Guild records occasionally hint at female participation too, like the silk weavers of Cologne or the female scribes in Paris who illuminated manuscripts alongside their fathers and husbands. The Church's relationship with women's learning was paradoxical. While it often reinforced gender barriers, it also provided rare avenues for intellectual expression. Nunneries became shelters for widows and unmarried noblewomen seeking refuge from political marriages, offering them access to books and debate. Some bishops even championed female scholars, like Abelard's fierce correspondent Helois, whose letters reveal a mind as sharp as any university theologian's. Yet by the late Middle Ages, cracks in this fragile ecosystem were showing. The rise of universities as the pinnacle of education sidelined convent schools, while guilds increasingly formalized exclusionary policies. Women's knowledge didn't disappear, it simply retreated further into the shadows, preserved in recipe books, herbal gardens, and the quiet mentorship of mothers to daughters. This hidden legacy challenges our assumptions about medieval education. When we picture a scholar, we might imagine a robed monk or a university master, but just as often, it was a woman annotating a manuscript's margins, a midwife diagnosing illness by the color of a patient's urine, or a merchant's wife calculating interest rates on loans. Their classrooms had no grand lecture halls. They were infirmaries, weaving rooms, and castle chambers where wisdom was whispered, demonstrated, and fiercely protected. The medieval world may have preached that women's minds were weaker, but their achievements, etched in parchment and practice, tell a very different story. The church didn't just teach it curated knowledge with the precision of a master librarian, deciding which texts deserved immortality and which should vanish into silence. Latin wasn't merely a language, it was the sacred key to unlocking scripture, philosophy, and law, a linguistic moat separating the educated elite from the masses. Monastic scribes spent lifetimes copying Augustine's sermons or Aristotle's logic, but only after ensuring every line aligned with doctrine. A single misstep, a hint of heresy, and a manuscript might be scraped clean, its vellum recycled for safer words. Yet for all its control, the church's grip was never absolute. Like water finding cracks in stone, forbidden ideas seeped through the margins. Consider the fate of ancient texts deemed dangerous. Works by thinkers like Lucretius, who argued the universe was made of atoms, or Hypatia's mathematical treatises, often survived only because a lone monk tucked them between devotional psalms, masking them as harmless curiosities. In cathedral schools, masters sometimes taught corrected versions of Aristotle, subtly bending his pagan philosophy to fit Christian theology, but the real rebellion happened beyond cloister walls. Traveling scholars called vagantes carried unapproved texts in their satchels, reciting verses in taverns where no bishop could hear. Some copied manuscripts in secret, their workshops hidden in attics or cellars, producing cheap, unadorned books that circulated among merchants and minor nobles. The church's greatest irony was its unintended role as a preservationist. By centralizing education, it created the very networks dissenters later exploited. Monastic libraries became treasure troves for curious minds, where a young clerk might accidentally discover a banned Roman poet while shelving theology tomes. Even the Inquisition's records reveal the persistence of underground learning cases of weavers debating scripture from memory, or farmers passing down folk remedies with roots in pagan traditions. Knowledge, it turns out, refuses to be caged. What emerged was a shadow education system, one where whispered conversations at market stalls carried more subversion than any lecture hall. A heretic might disguise radical ideas as children's rhymes, ensuring they'd be memorized before authorities could intervene. Apothecaries encoded forbidden medical knowledge in recipe books, their cures labeled as harmless kitchen lore. The church may have held the keys to formal learning, but the human hunger for understanding built backdoors, and through them crept the ideas that would one day ignite the Renaissance. Beneath the soaring arches of cathedrals and beyond the guarded gates of universities, a different kind of classroom thrived, one where lessons were whispered in the common tongue, not Latin, and where the price of knowledge could be imprisonment or worse. The Waldensians, a movement born in 12th century Lyon, didn't wait for the church's permission to teach. Their radical idea that every believer, even a shoemaker or a farmer's wife, should read scripture for themselves. By translating the Bible into Provençal and holding moonlit study sessions in cellars and forests, they turned the medieval world's hierarchy upside down. Meanwhile, in England, the Lollards took up the charge, smuggling handwritten copies of John Wycliffe's vernacular Bible into market towns. Their classrooms were haylofts and back rooms, their blackboards the palms of their hands, tracing verses in the dirt for illiterate neighbors to memorize. What made these groups so dangerous wasn't just their defiance, it was their pedagogy. Without access to parchment or printing presses, they relied on oral chains of transmission. A Lollard preacher might recite a passage until his listeners could echo it perfectly, then scatter like seeds to teach others. Waldensian, barbs, or itinerant teachers disguised doctrine as folk songs, ensuring even children could carry the forbidden words. These weren't just theological debates, they were experiments in mass education, proving that ideas could spread faster through spoken networks than through any scriptorium. And spread they did by the 14th century. Church tribunals groaned with cases of weavers quoting gospel passages in English, or peasants arguing about salvation in terms that echoed Wycliffe's sermons. The tools of this underground education were as ingenious as they were humble. A wax tablet could be smoothed clean after secret lessons, leaving no evidence. Knotted cords served as memory aids, each knot marking a key verse or argument. Some dissenters even used embroidery, subversive verses stitched into tapestries or clothing, hidden in plain sight. But the most powerful tool was the one thing authorities couldn't confiscate: the human memory. When a Lollard woman named Marjorie Baxter stood trial in 1428, her accusers were stunned by her ability to quote long Bible passages verbatim. "I learned them by heart," she shrugged, from a man who also held them in his head. This shadow education system's legacy was tectonic. By insisting that truth belonged to everyone, not just the Latin literate elite, these movements planted the seeds of the Reformation centuries before Luther. Their insistence on vernacular learning laid groundwork for the explosive spread of printed Bibles in the 1500s. Even their teaching methods endured. The Moravian Brethren, heirs to the Hussite reformers, would later use similar memory techniques to sustain their faith during persecution. The medieval church had built walls around knowledge, but the underground scholars proved that walls crumble when enough people whisper on the other side. Yet for all their innovation, these rebels shared one surprising trait with the institutions they defied: a deep faith in education's transformative power. Whether in a university disputation or a forest clearing, medieval people understood that to teach was to shape the future. The tools might differ, a monk's quill versus a Lollard's knotted string, but the hunger to learn, to question, to pass the torch burned just as bright. And that flame, flickering in hidden corners of the medieval world, would eventually light much bigger fires. Wax tablets were the medieval equivalent of a student's notebook, but with a twist. Imagine a wooden board coated in beeswax, its surface smooth and ready for the stylus's tip. A child learning Latin verbs would press the metal point into the wax, forming letters that could be erased with a quick swipe of the palm. No paper wasted, no ink spilled, just an endless cycle of practice and correction. These humble tools weren't just cheap, they were adaptable. A single tablet might hold geometry diagrams in the morning, a draft of a poem by noon, and a shopping list by evening. And when the lesson was over, a warm hand rubbed across the surface and it was blank again, ready for the next idea. But wax tablets were just the beginning. For numbers, students turned to the abacus, a grid of beads or lines that made complex calculations tangible. Picture a merchant's apprentice sliding counters along a wooden frame, translating abstract sums into physical movements. Each row represented units, tens, hundreds, a system so intuitive that a skilled user could outpace someone scribbling on parchment. This wasn't just arithmetic. It was a dance of logic where fingers learned to think. And for those without even an abacus, finger reckoning, a method so precise that Charlemagne reportedly demanded all his tax collectors master it. Numbers became gestures, a bent knuckle for 5, a tucked thumb for 10 silent signals that turned hands into living calculators. The real magic, though, lay in how medieval minds hacked memory itself. Without textbooks to reference, students relied on mnemonics, mental scaffolds built from rhymes, images, and even imagined architecture. A law student might visualize a sprawling palace, assigning each legal principle to a different room. To recall inheritance laws, he'd mentally stroll to the Hall of Wills, where a carved oak chest symbolized testamentary rights. Monks chanting psalms used similar tricks, embedding verses in melodic patterns that made forgetfulness nearly impossible. These techniques weren't just study aids, they reshaped the brain's very pathways, turning raw information into something as unforgettable as a childhood song. Some of these methods still echo in modern classrooms. Medical students today memorize anatomy with acronyms like "Never let monkeys eat bananas" for cranial nerves, just as medieval scholars used "Every good boy deserves favor" to recall musical notes. The rhyme scheme of Beowulf, a precursor to today's catchy jingles for remembering rules or dates. Even the wax tablet has its digital descendant, the tablet computer, where notes appear and vanish with a tap. The Middle Ages didn't just cope without books, they engineered workarounds so ingenious they outlasted the printing press. Yet across Europe's borders, education took wildly different shapes. In Islamic Cordoba, paper not wax flowed through bustling libraries, while Chinese scholars brushed ink onto delicate scrolls. The tools varied, but the goal was the same: to make knowledge stick, whether through a stylus, a bead, or a well-placed rhyme. Adaptation wasn't just a skill, it was the heartbeat of learning. While European monks hunched over wax tablets, a revolution in learning was unfolding under the sun-baked arches of Cordoba's libraries. Here in the Islamic world, knowledge wasn't just spoken, it was meticulously copied, translated, and debated across cultures. Caliphs sponsored massive translation projects, where teams of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side to rescue ancient Greek texts from oblivion. Aristotle's logic, Galen's medicine, Ptolemy's astronomy, all were rendered into Arabic, annotated with commentaries, and shared along trade routes stretching from Baghdad to Toledo. This wasn't just preservation, it was reinvention. Muslim scholars like Avicenna didn't merely copy Greek medical texts, they expanded them, pioneering hospitals with separate wards for contagious diseases, and writing encyclopedias that European universities would later rely on for centuries. Jewish scholars, meanwhile, perfected a parallel system of learning that bridged written and oral traditions. In yeshivas from Cairo to Mainz, students memorized the Talmud through a method called chavruta, pairing up to debate every syllable aloud, their voices weaving intricate arguments like threads in a tapestry. The text itself was sacred, but the real magic happened in the margins. Rabbis' commentaries layered atop commentaries, creating a living dialogue across generations. A question posed in 11th century France might receive an answer from 12th century Spain, with each scholar building on the last. This reverence for precise repetition didn't just preserve Hebrew scripture, it turned study into a form of worship where every word carried the weight of millennia. When these two worlds collided in medieval Spain, the sparks lit up European education. In Toledo's bustling translation schools, Jewish linguists fluent in Arabic and Latin worked with Christian clerics to render Avicenna's medical texts or Al-Khwarizmi's algebra into languages the West could understand. The result, a knowledge tsunami that reached Paris and Oxford by the 13th century. Suddenly, European scholars had access to ideas their Greek forebears never dreamed of, like the concept of zero from Hindu Arabic numerals, or advanced surgical techniques from Islamic medical manuals. Even the humble textbook format we know today with numbered chapters, indexes, and footnotes owes its existence to this cross-pollination. Yet for all this intellectual ferment, education remained brutally divided by class. A noble's son might study Latin grammar with a private tutor, his lessons punctuated by falconry practice and lute lessons. His peasant counterpart likely learned through his hands planting crops by his father's side, absorbing folk remedies from his mother, or if he was lucky, picking up bits of scripture from a traveling preacher. The gap wasn't just about resources, it was about purpose. Nobility educated for power to administer lands, negotiate marriages, and wield influence. Peasants educated for survival to read weather signs in cloud patterns, calculate harvest yields in their heads, and navigate a world where a single bad winter could mean starvation. The irony is that some of the most enduring medieval knowledge came from these uneducated corners. Herbalists who couldn't read Latin kept pharmacopoeias alive through oral recipes. Stonemasons with no formal geometry intuited structural principles that still baffle engineers today. The medieval world, for all its hierarchies, quietly proved that wisdom wears many faces, whether inscribed in leather-bound codices or etched into the calloused hands of those who built civilization from the ground up. The castle nursery and the plowed field might as well have existed on different planets when it came to medieval education. For noble children, learning began almost as soon as they could walk, not with alphabets but with the silent language of power. A young lordling practiced falconry by 6, learning to read the twitch of a goshawk's wings better than any parchment. By 12, he'd mastered chess, not just as a game but as training for battlefield strategy, each piece's movement drilling into him the hierarchy of feudal society. Music lessons on the lute or harp weren't mere hobbies. They were diplomatic tools, essential for entertaining foreign dignitaries or composing verses to flatter a potential ally's court. Even dancing had purpose. The intricate steps of a bass dance taught poise, while the whispered gossip between turns sharpened political instincts. This was education as performance, where every skill doubled as armor in the arena of nobility. Meanwhile, in the soot-blackened cottage down the valley, a peasant girl's classroom was the rhythm of the seasons. Her mother showed her how to test wheat kernels between teeth for ripeness, how to stitch wounds with boiled hog bristles when no barber surgeon could be afforded. Boys learned to plow straight furrows not with compasses, but by lining up distant trees as guides, a geometry of survival. These weren't crude lessons. They were precision tuned over generations, where a misjudged planting date could mean starvation. The irony, some of this folk knowledge was astonishingly sophisticated. Farmers practiced crop rotation centuries before agronomy textbooks explained nitrogen cycles, while midwives used herbal antiseptics like woundwort long before germ theory. Yet the divide wasn't always unbridgeable. Consider the case of Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son who became Cardinal and Lord Chancellor of England, his ticket out of Ipswich's slaughterhouse. A razor-sharp mind for Latin, honed at a local grammar school before Oxford recognized his brilliance. Or take Christine de Pizan, the Venetian merchant's daughter whose father's connections to the French court gave her access to libraries normally reserved for men. She didn't just read, she revolutionized medieval literature, becoming Europe's first professional female writer. These outliers reveal the cracks in the system. Talent, when noticed by the right patron, could sometimes trump birthright. Guilds offered another narrow ladder. A peasant boy apprenticed to a goldsmith might rise to master status through sheer virtuosity, his creations earning him noble patrons. The stained glass artisans of Chartres, many illiterate, commanded wages, rivaling university professors because their hands could translate sunlight into divine narratives. Social mobility wasn't common, but neither was it impossible. The catch, upward movement often required surrendering one identity for another. A peasant scholar like the 12th century philosopher John of Salisbury had to adopt the manners, dress, and even gait of the educated elite to be taken seriously. His old community saw him as a traitor. His new peers never quite forgot his origins. What's easily overlooked is how these parallel systems occasionally converged. A nobleman overseeing estates needed to understand his tenants' harvest methods, just as a clever peasant might mimic courtly speech to plead a case before the Lord. The real education divide wasn't just about skills, it was about access to the meta-knowledge of how systems worked. A noble learned who to bribe in a tax dispute. A peasant knew which mushrooms could ease the pain of a beating from that same tax collector. Both were surviving the Middle Ages, just with radically different toolkits. The parchment and the plowshare, the lute and the loom, each told a story about who got to shape the medieval world. But history has a way of blurring the lines we think are fixed. Today's university libraries preserve illuminated manuscripts commissioned by kings alongside herbals compiled by anonymous peasant healers. The uneducated hands that built flying buttresses outmade the scholars who theorized them. Perhaps the greatest lesson medieval education teaches is this: knowledge wears many disguises, and wisdom rarely cares about the costume it comes in. For every 100 medieval peasants who lived and died within sight of the same village church spire, there was the occasional boy or girl whose mind burned too brightly to be ignored. Take Thomas Aquinas, the hulking, quiet son of an Italian count's minor vassal, a child so intellectually voracious that his nickname among classmates was the dumb ox. His family expected military service, but young Thomas snuck off to join the Dominicans, trading a sword for parchment. Within decades, his writings would reshape Christian theology, proving that even in a rigid society, genius could pry open doors. Patronage was often the key. A local priest might notice a shepherd boy's knack for memorizing psalms and recommend him to a monastery. Wealthy merchants, eager to elevate their families, sometimes funded promising students at cathedral schools. In rare cases, talent trumped bloodline so dramatically that kings took notice, like the scholar John of Salisbury, who rose from peasant stock to become Bishop of Chartres through sheer force of intellect. These weren't fairy tales, they were hard-won victories against a system designed to keep most people in their place. Yet the cracks in the system were glaring. For every Thomas Aquinas, countless bright minds withered in obscurity. A girl with a gift for healing herbs might be labeled a witch rather than a physician. A serf's son who mastered Latin could still be barred from universities due to his low birth. Even successful outsiders faced whispers. Aquinas' noble peers never let him forget his stall-born origins despite his towering achievements. Critics of the era saw these contradictions clearly. The radical Franciscan friar Roger Bacon raged against education's gatekeepers, arguing that blocking talented commoners from learning was like burying gold in a field where none may dig. Satirists penned scathing allegories of ignorant nobles lecturing brilliant peasants on topics they barely understood. The system's defenders countered that social order required boundaries, but as medieval cities grew, so did the pressure to let merit occasionally override lineage. The most damning critique came from those the system left behind. In trial records, we glimpse frustrated artisans who taught themselves law to fight unjust taxes, or women like Marguerite Porete, whose mystical writings got her burned at the stake precisely because she dared to think beyond her station. Their stories remind us that education wasn't just about personal advancement, it was about who got to define truth itself. The medieval world may have preached that God ordered each to their place, but the hunger to learn kept proving that some boundaries were made to be crossed. Medieval education wasn't without its fault lines, cracks that critics were quick to point out, sometimes at great personal risk. One of the loudest complaints: the obsession with rote memorization. Imagine a room full of students chanting Aristotle's logic or scripture verses for hours, their voices rising and falling in unison. While this method preserved knowledge, it also risked turning minds into mere storage vaults rather than workshops of ideas. The 12th century philosopher John of Salisbury lamented how some scholars could recite entire books yet understand scarcely a word, comparing them to donkeys laden with sacks of gold but unable to spend a single coin. Creativity often withered under the weight of repetition, with original thought taking a backseat to flawless recall. Then there was the bottleneck of book scarcity. In an age where a single Bible might cost as much as a farmhand's yearly wages, access to written knowledge was brutally unequal. Scientific inquiry suffered most. A scholar in Paris could spend years waiting to consult Galen's medical texts, while breakthroughs in Arabic mathematics or astronomy trickled into Europe at a glacial pace. The Church's gatekeeping compounded the problem, censoring ideas that challenged doctrine, like the heliocentric theories of ancient Greeks, which were dismissed as dangerous fantasies. When the brilliant nun Hildegard of Bingen proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, her writings were quietly shelved, deemed too radical for wider circulation. Yet paradoxically, these very constraints became catalysts for ingenuity. The absence of books forced scholars to distill ideas to their essence, debating them in razor-sharp disputations where every premise had to be defended aloud. The Church's suspicion of unorthodox thought bred subtle rebellions like the rise of scholasticism, a method that used Aristotle's logic to poke holes in traditional theology, all while pretending to uphold it. Even memorization, for all its flaws, honed mental discipline that modern educators might envy. A medieval student could recite entire legal codes or recite backward the genealogies of kings, skills that today's spell-check-dependent minds would find unimaginable. Compare this to modern education's buffet of instant information, where medieval learners had to internalize knowledge deeply to compensate for scarce resources. Today's students often skim surfaces, knowing answers are a click away. The medieval mind was a fortress built to retain. The modern mind is a sieve optimized for filtering. Neither system is perfect, but each reflects the world that shaped it. The Middle Ages taught survival in a knowledge desert. We're learning to navigate a flood. What both eras share, though, is the unshakable belief that how we teach determines who we become. The medieval classroom might seem worlds apart from our screen-lit lecture halls, but the contrast reveals something surprising. Our modern education system might have more to learn from the past than we realize. Picture a university student today scrolling through digital notes on a tablet versus a 14th century scholar reciting Aristotle from memory. One relies on external storage, the other on mental discipline. Yet both are grappling with the same fundamental challenge: how to make knowledge stick. The medieval world, forced by necessity to prioritize deep retention over quick access, developed techniques we've nearly forgotten. Their reliance on oral debate sharpened critical thinking in ways our multiple-choice exams rarely do. Their apprenticeship model turned abstract concepts into muscle memory, something no online tutorial can replicate. And their memory palaces, a cognitive tool so effective that modern neuroscientists still study its power. Take the art of disputation, a cornerstone of medieval learning. In a university like Oxford or Paris, students didn't just absorb lectures, they defended positions in no-holds-barred verbal combat. A wrong step in logic could mean public humiliation, but the rewards were immense. This wasn't just about winning arguments, It was about learning to think under pressure, to adapt, to see holes in one's own reasoning. Compare that to today's passive learning, where a student might binge-watch recorded lectures without ever testing their understanding against a peer. The medieval approach bred resilience and intellectual agility, skills that feel urgently relevant in an era of misinformation and rapid change. Then there's the apprenticeship model, which turned learning into a full-body experience. A medieval stonemason didn't study geometry from a textbook. He felt it in the weight of a plumb line, the angle of a chisel. This hands-on wisdom, what philosopher Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge, can't be downloaded or streamed. Modern vocational programs still echo this approach, but what if we applied it broader? Imagine medical students diagnosing illnesses not just from screens but by actually touching patients, or engineers learning structural integrity by building scaled models, not just running simulations. The medieval world understood that some truths are best learned through the hands, yet the most striking legacy might be their memory techniques. In an age without search engines, forgetting wasn't an option. Scholars trained their minds like athletes, using vivid imagery and spatial associations to store vast amounts of information. A lawyer might mentally walk through a cathedral, assigning each legal principle to a different stained glass window. Today, we outsource memory to devices, but at what cost? Studies show that relying on digital storage weakens our ability to retain information long-term. The medieval solution: treat memory not as a hard drive, but as a living, trainable muscle. The real question isn't whether one system is superior, it's how we might blend the best of both. Could lecture halls revive the spirit of medieval disputation, turning monologues into dynamic debates? Might medical schools pair VR simulations with old-school anatomical drawings, engaging both eyes and hands? And what if we taught students to build memory palaces alongside digital note-taking, creating cognitive safety nets for when technology fails? The Middle Ages remind us that education isn't just about transmitting information, it's about forging minds that can question, create, and endure. Their tools were wax tablets and chants, ours are apps and algorithms. But the goal remains the same: to light fires of understanding that no darkness can extinguish. The ripple effects of medieval education reached far beyond the cloisters and guild halls, shaping the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance and the modern world in ways we still feel today. Those bustling cathedral schools didn't just vanish, they evolved into institutions like the University of Paris and Bologna, where the medieval trivium's focus on logic and rhetoric became the foundation for scientific inquiry and humanist thought. The guild's rigorous apprenticeships, they live on in today's trade schools and residency programs, where hands-on mastery still trumps textbook theories. Even the oral traditions, those rhythmic chants and memory palaces, left their mark, resurfacing in everything from Shakespearean soliloquies to the call and response of modern classrooms. Consider the Renaissance's explosion of creativity. It didn't spring from nowhere. The meticulous copying of ancient texts by monks preserved the very ideas that would later fuel thinkers like Erasmus and Galileo. The scholastic method, that relentless medieval habit of questioning every premise, became the engine of the scientific revolution. When Copernicus challenged the geocentric model, he was using a tool sharpened by centuries of university disputations. The guild's insistence on quality control, that ethos birthed the artisan workshops of Florence, where Michelangelo learned to carve marble under the same master-apprentice system that had shaped medieval stonemasons. Yet the most enduring lesson might be medieval education's adaptability. Faced with a scarcity of books, they turned limitations into strengths, prioritizing deep memory, debate, and hands-on skill. But what if history had taken a different turn? Imagine a world where Gutenberg's press arrived 6 centuries earlier, flooding monasteries with cheap parchment. Would the oral tradition have withered, leaving minds less nimble without the discipline of memorization? Would guilds have clung to secrecy if technical manuals circulated widely? The Middle Ages show us that education isn't just about the tools available, it's about how we choose to use them. Today's debates over screen time and AI tutors echo these age-old questions. Like medieval scholars grappling with the first flood of translated Arabic texts, we're learning that more information doesn't always mean wiser minds. The real legacy of those candlelit classrooms isn't their methods, it's their proof that education's purpose transcends its form. Whether carved in wax or projected on screens, learning thrives when it challenges hands, voices, and minds in equal measure. The past whispers a warning: convenience shouldn't replace craftsmanship in the art of teaching. What if Gutenberg's printing press had arrived not in the 15th century, but the 5th? Picture monasteries stacked not with painstakingly copied manuscripts, but with crisp, identical books, their pages whispering to anyone who could read. Would knowledge have cascaded down the social ladder, eroding the monopoly of Latin literate elites? Might peasant children have traced letters in the dirt by firelight, their minds kindled by words once reserved for bishops and nobles? The tantalizing possibility shimmers, a medieval world where ideas flowed as freely as ink, where heresies couldn't be contained by controlling scribes, where the very fabric of power might have frayed at the edges. Yet every revolution carries its shadow. The oral traditions that bound communities together, the fireside epics, the guild chants, the call and response of scripture lessons, might have withered in the glare of printed pages. Something visceral would have been lost, the warmth of a teacher's voice shaping young minds not through lifeless type, but through shared breath and gesture. Storytelling wasn't just a delivery method, it was the glue of memory, the rhythm that made laws, prayers, and histories unforgettable. A printed book could inform, but could it make a roomful of villagers weep for Beowulf's fallen comrades or recite the Magna Carta from heart? The medieval world understood something we've since forgotten. Knowledge isn't just absorbed, it's performed. Consider the trade-offs. Mass-produced books might have democratized learning, but at the cost of depth. When every student owns a textbook, who bothers to memorize the intricate cadence of Virgil's verses or the precise folds of a geometric proof? The medieval mind, trained by scarcity, became a vault of layered understanding, a skill our swipe and scroll habits have eroded. Yet the counterargument whispers back: how many brilliant minds were squandered in fields and hovels, their potential barred by the sheer accident of birth? The tragedy of medieval education wasn't its methods, but its exclusions. This tension still echoes today. Digital platforms promise universal access to learning, yet algorithms silo us into intellectual bubbles as rigid as any medieval guild. We've traded memory for search engines, debate for comment threads, apprenticeships for tutorial videos. The medieval world warns us: no tool is neutral. Every leap forward in how we learn comes with quiet losses we only notice when the last storyteller falls silent, or when a generation realizes it can recite memes but not sonnets. Now let's retrace our steps through the most startling revelations of this journey. Did you know that the rote memorization we dismiss as medieval drill work actually rewire brains for superior recall? Or that guild apprenticeships routinely lasted longer than modern PhD programs, producing masters whose hands held lifetimes of precision? From the nuns who smuggled science into illuminated manuscripts to the peasant mnemonists who carried entire legal codes in their heads, the Middle Ages force us to ask: have we traded wisdom for convenience? Their answers might unsettle you. Debating for hours without a single note might sound like a nightmare to today's students, but for medieval scholars, it was the ultimate test of mastery. Picture this, a crowded hall at the University of Paris where two students stand toe-to-toe, dissecting Aristotle's logic entirely from memory. One misstep, a misquoted passage or a flawed syllogism, and the entire room would erupt in correction. This wasn't just academic theater, it was a mental marathon. Students trained for years to hold entire texts in their heads, weaving arguments on the fly like intellectual blacksmiths hammering raw ideas into shape. The secret, a curriculum built on relentless repetition. Before ever setting foot in a disputation, a scholar might recite the same legal commentary 100 times, not just to memorize it, but to internalize its rhythm until the words became second nature. Now shift your gaze to the quiet cloisters where nuns like Hildegard of Bingen were quietly rewriting the rules of women's education. While most girls were learning domestic skills, these women were passing Latin theology, composing music, and even dabbling in natural science. Hildegard's writings on medicine with their detailed descriptions of herbs and humors weren't just copied, they were cited by male physicians centuries later. Convents became unlikely hubs of female scholarship, where abbesses like Herad of Landsberg compiled encyclopedias, and scribes like End of Spain painted celestial diagrams with the precision of astronomers. The irony, these women often had more access to books than university men, thanks to monastic scriptoriums that doubled as their classrooms. The memory techniques they used would put today's productivity gurus to shame. A law student might visualize a sprawling castle, assigning each legal concept to a different room, trespass laws in the pantry, inheritance rules in the tower. This memory palace method wasn't just creative, it was neurologically ingenious. Modern studies show these spatial mnemonics activate multiple brain regions, creating recall pathways far stickier than rote repetition. Monks took it further, chanting psalms in melodic patterns that tapped into the same cognitive hooks as catchy jingles. The result, a Benedictine could recite all 150 psalms, over 70,000 words, by heart with fewer errors than a modern student reading off a screen. Apprenticeships, meanwhile, were the ultimate slow education. A stonemason's apprentice didn't just watch his master carve gargoyles. He spent years mixing mortar, hauling stones, and tracing geometric patterns in the dirt before ever touching a chisel. Guilds enforced this glacial pace deliberately. Mastery wasn't about talent alone, but about imprinting craft into muscle memory. The 10-year timeline wasn't arbitrary. It mirrored the time neuroscientists now say it takes to achieve true expertise in complex skills. Compare that to today's crash courses, and you start to wonder who really had the better system. Perhaps most startling of all, some universities awarded degrees based solely on oral defense. At Bologna, a law student's entire career hinged on one public performance, a multi-day disputation where he'd field questions from professors trying to trip him up. No written thesis, no multiple-choice exams, just the raw pressure of thinking aloud under fire. The modern equivalent would be defending your PhD dissertation without notes, slides, or even a printed copy of your research. It was brutal, but it worked. These graduates entered the world with minds as sharp as their tongues, ready to argue cases before kings or draft laws for burgeoning cities. What fascinates modern scholars isn't just the strangeness of these methods, but their eerie relevance. Cognitive scientists now champion retrieval practice, the medieval art of recitation, as superior to passive highlighting. Historians trace the roots of modern debate clubs and moot courts straight back to those raucous university halls. Even the decade-long apprenticeships find echoes in today's calls for deeper vocational training. The medieval world, for all its constraints, understood something we're still relearning. Real knowledge isn't just consumed, it's forged through struggle, repetition, and the kind of hands-on grit no app can replicate. Historians are sounding an alarm about our modern learning crisis, and surprisingly, the solution might lie in a dusty medieval classroom. While we drown in digital distractions, the medieval world's razor-sharp focus on oral debate and tactile mastery is making scholars rethink everything. Take Cambridge researcher Dr. Elena Jenga, who argues that today's students suffer from information obesity, are consuming endless data but struggling to digest it. Medieval learners, by contrast, had to internalize knowledge so thoroughly they could reconstruct entire legal arguments from memory. It wasn't just about what they knew, but how deeply it lived in their bones. This isn't just nostalgia. Schools from Norway to New Zealand are experimenting with medieval-inspired reforms. At a Rotterdam vocational college, engineering students now spend their first year building trebuchets and arched bridges, no textbooks allowed. The result, a 23% jump in spatial reasoning scores compared to peers in traditional lectures. Meanwhile, our Oxford pilot program revived the oral disputation, tasking law students to argue cases without notes. At first, they panic, admits Professor Thomas Whitfield. Then something clicks, they start listening instead of just waiting to speak. The real surprise is how medieval memory techniques are infiltrating Silicon Valley. Tech CEOs have latched onto the method of loci, the memory palace trick used by monks to recite scripture. One startup founder memorized his entire pitch deck by mentally walking through his childhood home, assigning each slide to a different piece of furniture. It sounds absurd until you realize our brains evolved to remember stories and spaces, not bullet points, explains cognitive scientist Dr. Mira Chen. Her research shows medieval mnemonics boost recall threefold over digital note-taking, but the most radical application might be in medicine. Johns Hopkins now trains surgeons with a modified guild system. Residents shadow master surgeons for thousands of hours before touching a scalpel, mirroring the medieval apprentice's decade-long journey. The difference: where guilds guarded secrets, modern mentors stream procedures in VR. Mastery can't be rushed, says Dr. Amina Khalid, who cites medieval stonemasons as her inspiration. They understood that hands learn what eyes can't see. Critics argue these methods are impractical at scale. How do you replicate one-on-one apprenticeships in crowded public schools? Yet Finland's education minister points to their craft weeks, where students ditch screens to learn blacksmithing or weaving, subjects that demand the same intense focus medieval guilds prized. Early data shows participants return to math and reading with renewed concentration. The lesson isn't about rejecting technology, but recovering balance. Medieval education thrived on constraints we've erased. Scarcity forced depth, oral culture honed listening, and hands-on learning bridged theory and practice. As Dr. Jenga puts it, they didn't have ChatGPT, but they didn't need it. Their minds were the original large language models, trained not on data scraps, on lived wisdom. Perhaps the future of learning doesn't lie ahead, but in those quiet moments when a student's fingers shape clay as their mentor once did, connecting across centuries through the unbroken rhythm of craft. Walk into a modern classroom, and you might witness something unexpected: students seated in a circle, passionately debating ethical dilemmas without a single textbook in sight. This is no ordinary discussion. It's a Socratic seminar, a direct descendant of medieval disputations. The teacher, playing the role of a scholastic master, guides but never dominates, challenging students to defend their views with logic rather than regurgitated facts. Sound familiar? It should. This method, now celebrated as innovative, traces its roots to those raucous university halls where medieval scholars honed their wits through verbal sparring. The twist: today's students aren't just reciting Aristotle, they're dissecting climate change or social justice, proving that old tools can sharpen new ideas. Meanwhile, in a sunlit workshop across town, a group of high schoolers bend over wooden frames, their hands shaping raw timber into graceful arches. No PowerPoint slides, no multiple-choice quizzes, just the tactile dance of muscle and material. This is the guild system reimagined for the 21st century. Schools like Philadelphia's Workshop School have ditched traditional lectures for apprenticeships with local carpenters, engineers, and chefs. The results: students who might struggle with abstract equations in algebra can calculate load-bearing ratios instinctively after a week of building bridges. It's like their hands unlock their brains, one teacher observes, echoing what medieval masters knew all along. Some truths are best learned through the fingertips. Then there's the memory revival. In a California middle school, students compete in mnemonic Olympics, using medieval techniques to memorize everything from periodic tables to Shakespearean sonnets. One 8th grader maps the digestive system onto her neighborhood street's stomach at the coffee shop, intestines winding down the bike path, a trick straight from the memory palaces of 13th century scholars. Teachers report a curious side effect. Kids who once forgot homework assignments can now recall complex sequences effortlessly. It's not about rote drill, explains educator Luis Marquez. It's about giving knowledge a home in the mind. So what does this mean for you? Whether you're a student drowning in flashcards or a professional battling information overload, the medieval playbook offers lifelines. Try defending your next work proposal in a mock disputation, and you'll quickly spot weaknesses invisible on paper. Struggling to master a skill? Emulate guild apprentices, break it into micro-actions, repeat until your body knows the rhythm. Even something as simple as turning your daily walk into a memory palace, assigning facts to landmarks, can transform forgetfulness into fluency. The past isn't just a curiosity, it's a mirror reflecting gaps in our modern methods. Those candlelit classrooms thrived not because they had all the answers, but because they asked the right questions. How do we make knowledge stick? How do we think, not just remember? Their solutions were born of necessity, but their wisdom is timeless. After all, the human brain hasn't changed, only the tools we've forgotten how to use. Want to experience medieval learning firsthand? Start by memorizing a short poem, not by writing it down, but by speaking it aloud, letting the rhythm guide your recall like a 13th century scholar. Notice how the words cling to your mind differently when they're carried by sound rather than sight. Or try learning a new skill the guild way. Watch a baker knead dough or a potter shape clay, then replicate their motions without instructions, training your hands to understand what your brain can't yet explain. These aren't just history exercises, they're windows into a lost art of deep learning. Debate is where medieval methods truly shine. Gather friends and argue a topic, any topic, without notes or devices. Force yourself to think on your feet, to listen and respond rather than recite prepared points. You'll quickly discover what university students did centuries ago. The heat of live discussion forges sharper ideas than any solitary study session. The key isn't winning the argument, but training your mind to weave logic under pressure, just as swordsmen drilled until parries became instinct. But here's the real secret these experiments reveal. Education isn't about the tools at your disposal, but how you engage with them. A monk with a single parchment often internalized texts more thoroughly than a modern student with a library in their pocket. Apprentices without blueprints mastered geometries that baffle today's CD-trained architects. The difference: medieval learning demanded full immersion, mind, body, and voice united in the act of knowing. Yet for all their brilliance, medieval approaches are often misunderstood. Some dismiss them as primitive, forgetting that Oxford's debating traditions birthed modern scientific inquiry. Others romanticize them, ignoring how exclusionary they could be. The truth lies in the middle. Their methods were imperfect, but their insights about human cognition remain startlingly relevant. They understood that memory thrives on rhythm, that skill lies in the hands as much as the head, and that true mastery requires not just consumption, but creation. Lessons our screen-saturated world would do well to remember. The next time you struggle to recall a fact or master a new technique, ask yourself, how would a guild apprentice approach this? Could breaking it into a chant help? Would debating it aloud reveal hidden flaws? Sometimes progress doesn't mean inventing new methods, but rediscovering old ones, not because they're ancient, but because they work. After all, the medieval world built cathedrals that still take our breath away and preserved ideas that still shape our thinking. Their classrooms had no technology, but they understood something we're still relearning. The most powerful educational tool isn't a device or a book. It's the human mind unleashed by the right challenges. Medieval education often gets painted with the broad brush of the Dark Ages, a time when ignorance supposedly smothered innovation. But peel back the layers and you'll find a world humming with intellectual energy, where constraints sparked creativity rather than crushing it. Take the myth that medieval people believed the earth was flat. Not only is this false, but scholars like Bede and Aquinas openly discussed the planet's spherical shape, using observations from ancient Greek texts preserved in monastic libraries. The real story isn't about ignorance, it's about how knowledge survived against the odds, adapted, and even advanced in unexpected ways. Another persistent fiction. That the Church stifled all scientific inquiry. While it's true that certain ideas faced resistance, monasteries were also where early experiments in optics, astronomy, and medicine quietly unfolded. The Venerable Bede calculated the tides using lunar cycles centuries before Newton. Hildegard of Bingen documented the medicinal properties of plants with a precision that would make modern botanists nod in respect. Even the much maligned scholastic debates, often mocked as nitpicking over how many angels can dance on a pin, were actually rigorous exercises in logical reasoning, laying groundwork for the scientific method. The Church wasn't a monolith of oppression. It was a complex ecosystem where curiosity and doctrine sometimes clashed but often coexisted. Then there's the stereotype of medieval classrooms as joyless drills of rote memorization. In reality, learning was often deeply interactive. University students didn't just recite texts, they wrestled with them in spirited disputations, where the goal wasn't blind obedience but mastery through argument. Guild apprenticeships blended practical skill with problem solving. Think of a stonemason troubleshooting a collapsing arch by applying geometric principles learned through trial and error. These weren't minds numbed by repetition, they were minds sharpened by challenge. The most damaging myth of all, that medieval education was a dead end, irrelevant to the modern world. Nothing could be further from the truth. The trivium's focus on grammar, rhetoric, and logic birthed the liberal arts. The guild system's emphasis on mentorship lives on in medical residencies and trade apprenticeships. Even our modern universities owe their degree structures and lecture formats to medieval prototypes. The past isn't a primitive precursor to our enlightenment. It's a foundation we're still building upon, often without realizing it. So why does this matter? Because how we view history shapes how we view progress. Dismissing the Middle Ages as a stagnant void ignores the resilience and ingenuity that kept ideas alive through plagues, wars, and political upheaval. It overlooks the quiet revolutions like the shift from oral to written culture or the rise of vernacular teaching that made the Renaissance possible. Most of all, it blinds us to the lesson at the heart of medieval education, that innovation doesn't require perfect conditions. Sometimes it thrives precisely because the stakes are high, the resources scarce, and the need to adapt relentless. The medieval world didn't just endure, it taught us how to think our way forward. Education systems don't just teach facts, they reveal what a culture cherishes, fears, and aspires to become. In medieval Europe, where survival depended on tight-knit communities and divine favor, education was a collective act. Knowledge passed through the rhythm of chanted psalms in monasteries, the shared labor of guild workshops, and the communal recitation of laws under village oaks. Learning wasn't about personal achievement, it was about sustaining a web of relationships to God, to one's craft, to the feudal order. Contrast that with today's hyper-individualized classrooms, where students stare at personalized screens, algorithms track their unique progress, and success is measured by personal rankings. The shift isn't just technological, it's philosophical. We've traded the medieval emphasis on communal memory for a world that prizes self-expression and disruption. Yet neither system is flawless. The medieval model fostered deep, embodied knowledge. Think of a mason who could sense a cathedral's stress points by the sound of his chisel, but often at the cost of exclusion. Women, peasants, and religious minorities faced barriers we'd find intolerable today. Modern education, for all its inclusivity, struggles with the opposite problem: endless access but shallow retention. Students swipe through digital flashcards instead of wrestling with ideas in debate, trading the medieval mind's vault-like retention for the convenience of search engines. The irony: today's employers increasingly crave medieval-style skills, apprenticeship-trained critical thinkers who can solve problems without a manual, while our schools prioritize standardized testing. The most revealing difference lies in how each era defines wisdom. Medieval universities celebrated the magister, the master who could synthesize theology, law, and natural philosophy into a unified vision of truth. Today's specialists drill deep into narrow fields, but few are trained to connect the dots between them. A 13th century scholar like Albertus Magnus wrote with equal authority about astronomy and morality, seeing creation as an interconnected whole. Our fragmentation of knowledge has yielded breakthroughs in niche fields, but left us longing for the kind of big-picture thinking that built cathedrals as both engineering marvels and spiritual symbols. Perhaps the lesson isn't about choosing one model over the other, but recognizing what each does best. The medieval world understood that some knowledge must be lived to be learned, through the hands, the voice, the communal ritual. We excel at scaling access and fostering innovation, but risk losing the depth that comes from struggle and repetition. Imagine a hybrid, digital tools that don't just deliver information, but train minds in the medieval art of focused disputation. Classrooms where students master coding not just through tutorials, but by apprenticing with engineers, absorbing the craft's unspoken rhythms. The future of education might lie in blending the best of both worlds, the inclusivity and adaptability of modern systems with the depth and intentionality of medieval ones. After all, the goal hasn't changed in 1,000 years, not just to fill minds, but to forge them. Across the centuries, one truth remains unshaken: the human drive to learn transcends the tools at hand. The medieval world, often mislabeled as an era of stagnation, proved just the opposite. With no printing presses, few books, and limited literacy, they didn't surrender to ignorance. Instead, they turned constraints into catalysts, crafting an education system as resourceful as it was resilient. Monks memorized entire libraries to preserve them. Apprentices spent a decade mastering a single craft until their hands could teach their minds. Scholars transformed oral debates into intellectual furnaces, forging ideas sharp enough to shape civilizations. What's humbling is how familiar their struggles feel. Today, we fret over screen time and AI replacing teachers, just as medieval scribes likely worried quills would weaken memory. Yet their solutions whisper to us through time. When books were scarce, they prioritized depth over breadth, internalizing knowledge so thoroughly it became part of them. When access was unequal, they built parallel systems, guilds for hands-on learners, convents for women barred from universities, underground networks for banned ideas. Their world reminds us that education isn't about having every resource. It's about leveraging whatever you have with relentless creativity. Consider the quiet rebellion of a medieval midwife, denied formal medical training yet compiling generations of herbal wisdom into handwritten remedy books. Or the peasant who couldn't read Latin but could calculate crop rotations with lunar precision. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that learning flourishes in the margins, often where institutions least expect it. The same spark animates today's grassroots movements, from coding boot camps in basements to YouTube-taught musicians. The tools change, but the instinct endures. Where there's curiosity, a way forward will be carved. So let's return to where we began, that candlelit classroom without textbooks. At first glance, it seems worlds apart from our digital age, but look closer and you'll spot the same essentials. A teacher's voice guiding discovery, students wrestling with ideas until they make sense, the unshakable belief that knowledge is worth pursuing, no matter the obstacles. The medieval world didn't just teach subjects, it taught how to learn under pressure, a lesson as vital now as then. Perhaps their greatest legacy isn't in the methods they left behind, but in the mindset they modeled. Faced with scarcity, they chose abundance of ingenuity, of community, of stubborn faith in the next generation's potential. As we navigate our own educational crossroads, their example challenges us to ask not just what we're teaching, but how we're equipping minds to thrive in uncertainty. After all, the future belongs not to those with the most information, but to those who have learned how to think, adapt, and persevere, whether with a tablet or a wax stylus in hand. The echoes of medieval education surround us more than we realize, not in dusty manuscripts, but in the living rhythms of how we teach and learn today. Consider the humble lecture hall. A professor stands before rows of students, unpacking complex ideas through spoken word, just as medieval masters did under the vaulted ceilings of Paris and Oxford. The difference, where they relied on memory, we have slideshows, yet both systems share a core belief in the power of human voice to shape understanding. This isn't nostalgia, it's proof that some methods endure because they tap into something fundamental about how minds grow. Take debate, that fiery medieval tradition of intellectual combat. Modern mock trials, model UN conferences, and even high school ethics classes all channel that same energy, the belief that truth emerges when ideas are tested in the crucible of argument. Medieval scholars would nod in recognition at today's startup pitch competitions, where entrepreneurs defend their visions before skeptical panels. The tools have changed, but the essence remains. We still learn deepest when forced to articulate, defend, and refine our thoughts under pressure. Hands-on learning, too, carries medieval fingerprints. Medical students practicing sutures on synthetic skin are heirs to guild apprentices who stitched wounds with boiled thread. Coding boot camps, where students build projects side by side, mirror the collaborative workshops where masons passed down the secrets of flying buttresses. Even the resurgence of vocational education, long dismissed as less than academic pursuits, speaks to a renewed appreciation for the medieval insight that wisdom lives in practiced hands as much as in theoretical minds. Yet the most profound legacy isn't a technique, but a mindset. In an age of climate crises and AI revolutions, medieval education's core lesson adaptability feels urgently relevant. They thrived not despite constraints, but because of them, turning scarcity into creativity. When books were rare, they honed memory. When institutions excluded, they built alternatives. Their greatest gift wasn't the trivium or the guild system, but the unshakable conviction that learning isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with it. As this journey through candlelit classrooms and bustling workshops ends, consider this. The next time you memorize a phone number instead of looking it up, debate a friend over coffee, or master a skill through repetition, you're walking paths first carved by medieval minds. Their world may seem distant, but their questions: how do we preserve knowledge? How do we think critically? How do we pass the torch? Are timeless. So here's to learning in all its forms across all ages. Press subscribe to keep exploring history's hidden classrooms, and share in the comments, which medieval teaching method would you revive today? Until our next adventure, remember, every lesson, no matter how modern, stands on shoulders much older than we think.